Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to today's webinar, where we will look at commercial reports with Groundsure. My name is Bronwyn Townsend, and I'm the Marketing Executive here at InfoTrack. I'm joined today by Andrew Crawshaw from Groundsure. In this session, we will look at which commercial environmental reports are available and which best suits your transaction. Before we begin the webinar, which should take no longer than 40 minutes, I'd like to draw your attention to a box on the webinar software that allows you to ask questions as we go through. Type them in here and we'll answer any questions at the end of the session. I'll now hand over to Andy to present.
Well, thanks, Bron. And as Bron said, what I'll be doing today is just covering which commercial report will suit which different transaction, but also giving you an idea of who we are at Groundsure, what we do and how we do it as well, just to give you an idea and a bit of background into actually what the process is for our consultants to go through, as it is often conceived that these reports are just churned out by a computer, which is a million miles away from what actually happens when producing commercial reports. So just to give you an idea, here at Groundsure, so we're based down in Brighton, down on the south coast. We have one office and one floor in the office, which we like to think makes our customer services that bit better, because you're only about 5 to 10 meters away from the person that you need to speak to deal with any queries. We have our own environmental consultants, so about 30 to 35 of them in the office, split into a residential team and a commercial team, who actually sit there and write these reports. And also, we always like to point out that on the bottom of every single one of our environmental reports is our direct telephone number. If your clients ever have a question about one of our reports, they can actually call us directly and speak to the person who wrote the report themselves. Saves you getting involved in environmental issues that you probably don't want to, and lets us deal with any problems that come up, as opposed to you taking the time out of your day to go through the process of dealing with it yourselves. So in terms of what we look at, contaminated land is obviously the biggest thing that we look at in environmental reports, and the management of risk is central to the lending process. Lenders need to consider whether clean-up costs may affect the borrower's ability to repay the loan and implications of contamination on security value. Environmental risk is relevant to lenders in three main ways. First of all, the ability of the borrower to make repayments may be affected by environmental liabilities, so the credit risk. Environmental issues can affect the value and the saleability of the lender's security, so that the value of security. And in certain circumstances, lenders can themselves incur direct liability for environmental problems. We will discuss these further in a bit later on. But there is an increased level of environmental awareness and public concern about environmental issues. It means that lenders need to consider their position carefully before being associated with projects that may be environmentally damaging. So, e.g., something like contaminated sites in the UK, or further afield, major infrastructure projects in developing countries. In the 1990s and early 2000s, lender liability for the remediation of contaminated land was considered the greatest environmental risk for lenders. The threat of liability from Part 2A of the Environmental Protection Act initially drove the introduction and use of environmental due diligence in banks, but instances such as lender liability are now considered highly unlikely. While lending to commercial clients seeking finance for land redevelopment, banks are capable of incurring a number of environmental risks. The four main risks are lender liability, the indirect risks such as credit and security risks, reputational risk, and number 4, market risk. In response to the environmental risks, lenders have introduced specific due diligence methods for assessing the eligibility of their borrowers. The UK's expertise in land remediation has been born out of necessity. As the first industrialised country in the world, the UK has over 4,000 hectares of contaminated land, much of it a legacy of the Industrial Revolution. The Environment Agency estimate that around 300,000 hectares of land in England and Wales is affected to some extent by industrial contamination. However, we've done some research here at Groundsure using our new unique historic mapping data, and it's revealed that around 619,000 hectares was formerly covered by a wide range of industrial sites, and this is more than double the Environment Agency's figures. This equates to around 4% of land in England and Wales. And if you think that only, just over 1,000 hectares of England and Wales land masses been officially designated as contaminated land, this suggests that there is the significant potential for more contaminated land sites to be identified based on the variance in brownfield land estimation. So in terms of the data that we use, our historical land use database is possibly our biggest asset here at Groundsure. Now, ensuring that we take into account different types of data when it comes to contaminated land, this is crucial in just being able to paint a more complete picture and be able to assess risk as quickly and as accurately as possible. This historical land use database that we use is an asset with over 27,000 individual land uses dating back to 1842. So as you can see on this slide, this is an old disused railway site where it's got depots, warehouses, tanks and other features just on this one site. Typically a site like this would have a polygon drawn around the whole site and listed as a disused railway site by most environmental consultants. But what we do at Groundsure is we actually highlight and draw a polygon around every single feature on that site, as you can see here. We highlight each individual feature, we categorize them, and then we risk rank them. And this is why we have 27,000 individual land uses. This greater level of detail results in more accurate outcomes, which can have a significant bearing on the number of reports needing further review by environmental consultants, and hence can reduce the time needed to return reports to our clients. And just to give you an idea of how we did this, so about 15, 16 years ago, we scanned and digitized about 1.5 million historical maps. And this is what the mapping will look like with the original paper copies. All land uses were identified and labeled by hand to enable the next process of digitizing the data. And then this is the same location as the paper map, but a digital copy. All of our maps are scanned in colour where available and at the highest resolution available on the market, which is 500 dots per inch. So the next process was to go through over 1.5 million maps and actually polygonize and label all the relevant features. And this is what makes up this historical land use database. So you might realize that when you order a report, especially a residential report, but with some of our commercial reports as well, that you'll get them back extremely quickly. It's because we've already done that work behind the scenes, that when you put an address in, we know exactly what's there, we know exactly when it dates to, and we know exactly what the risk is associated with it already. So what will happen in terms of our consultants' professional opinion? I'll take you through the differences in reports and the level of detail they go in. But for some of our commercial reports, the report is replaced by the client. It will go through this risk algorithm. If a land use of concern is identified in proximity to the site, the report will be referred to our consultants, who can then view the land uses of concern via our system called the Consultatron, which is our portal for report writing. The consultants will then interrogate the historical maps and our data to determine the level of risk. Any additional information, so the little map in the bottom left-hand corner, you can see these blue circles. If you get us any information from the local authority, from the planning department, or if it's a new build development, an NHBC policy, then what we will do is we'll attach it to the issue that we've identified. Say it's a petrol station with underground storage tanks, for example. So if you're dealing with another property in the vicinity in the future, we will already have that information stored on our database, so we won't ask you to go get it again, and hopefully we can give a positive outcome on the report. And then, as I said, a lot of work does go into actually producing these reports. And just to give you an idea of exactly what our consultants will do, they are trained environmental consultants, and land is only contaminated where there is a pollutant linkage, which is where a sensitive receptor can be exposed to a contaminant source through an identifiable exposure pathway. So we use a contaminant pathway receptor conceptual model, as this diagram illustrates to you on your screen. Some of the potential sources that we will be looking for will include things like bulk material storage, such as tanks, any processing areas, any drainage or pipework, or any waste storage and disposal. Clues to this can be found in the current and historical mapping, permits and licenses for potentially contaminative processes, and planning permissions as well. And in terms of sensitive receptors, As part of the commissioning process for any of our reports, there are questions about how the site is used and how it might be used in the future. We'll go through this a bit later, but this is crucial, particularly at the moment of where commercial properties are being converted into residential dwellings, for example. We know exactly what's going on. And then in terms of the pathway, how does a potential contaminant migrate and how do receptors come into contact with them? A lot of what is happening is actually below ground, so to get an idea of what's underneath is something that we will look at in our data as well. So it's not the size of the site that is important, but it is the environmental context. So the geology, the surface water, the groundwater, proximity to any sort of potential contaminant sources, and particularly what the end use is. This is doubly important as it influences who might come into contact with the ground and water, but whether we are assessing the report to support planning or for financial risk assessment. So we will always look for the significant possibility of significant harm. So this is what our consultants will look for when they're writing one of our reports. If we go back to that Source-Pathway-Receptor model and the linkage between them, a consultant's first priority is to identify what can be harmed on or in the vicinity of the property. They'd look at residential dwellings, particularly with garden space, any surface water features such as streams, ponds or drains, any aquifers beneath the sites, checking for groundwater, and also any environmentally sensitive areas. First of all, there's a visual inspection of the site using various maps, so current mapping, Google Maps, Google Earth, and the data collected within the report. Next, they'll have a look at the potential sources of contamination, and this can be current and or historic, looking at databases within the report, current industrial uses, permits and registers, landfills and waste sites, and historic mapping. They usually look within 30 metres of a site, with exceptions including landfill sites, which we will look up to 250 metres away, in accordance with relevant guidelines. Anything they identify as a potential source of contamination gets investigated further, and an appropriate risk assessment is assigned based on risk to receptors identified. The risk assessment is based on potential for a pathway to exist between a source of contamination and a potential receptor, and the more likely it is, the higher the risk ranking and the more detail we'll need to pass a report. This is an extremely summarised version of what our consultants do, but it does give you a quick glimpse of what the process is. There's a lot of time, care and attention to detail put into each and every single report that comes from our commercial team. And once a report has been carefully written, a second consultant then goes on to peer review every commercial report just to ensure that the final report that gets sent to you and your client is of the utmost quality and integrity. So I mentioned that we ask these commercial land use questions that are really important in how our consultants write the report, and they will give their bespoke guidance and opinion based on the answers given to these questions. So we'll ask what the current land use is. We can get a very good idea of this using current mapping, data on recent land uses and Google Street View, for example. However, businesses change hands frequently, so we like to double check that the current land use is what we think it is, just to make sure we have the most up-to-date information on the site. We'll also ask what the intended land use is, and is the site to be redeveloped? Obviously, we have no way of knowing what the client intends to use the site for. This information can help us make sure we are giving the right advice. For example, if the site is to change use to a more sensitive land use, this could bring into effect certain planning laws that we might need to make the client aware of. And if it's redeveloped, it changes the advice we can give again, because we'll also look at any sort of planning legislation that might be present in this instance. We'll also have ask a question about significant built fuel storage on the site, because there isn't a complete data set for that. So we like to know if the client's aware that it's there, so that we can actually give an opinion on that as well. And just to give you an example of how it is important, if you have a gasworks, for example, and it's staying as a gasworks, the environmental risk associated with that is a lot less than if you're building a school on it, or residential properties, for example, where people can come into contact with the ground that's been dug up. So these questions are vitally important for our consultants, and we always appreciate them being filled in with the most detail that you can. So we also give different risk rankings on our commercial reports, and this is a lot to do with the work that we do with banks. So We work very closely with Barclays Bank, we work very closely with RBS, and we do some work with Santander as well. So the ranking that we'll give on this is to give them the knowledge that they're safe in the lending process. So we will have a look if a site is of low contamination or low risk of contamination, which means that significant liability is unlikely. Low to moderate, it is significant or significantly unlikely, but minor issues may be present. Moderate, there may be some potential liability, but unlikely to represent immediate issue. Moderate to high, potential significant liability identified and further information is needed. And then high risk as well, which means there is potential significant liability identified. There might be future due diligence work, and you might look to actually restructure the deal that's been put in place, or get something more more detailed in terms of a site walkover, which I can take you through as well in a few slides' time. Now, recommendations for our commercial reports are always bespoke and tailored to the needs of the report. The recommendations are dependent on the overall risk assessment, what the intended use of the site is. If the site is to be redeveloped, then additional factors are taken into consideration, and they are highly linked to the land uses identified on site or within the vicinity. So we will look at getting in touch with the local authorities, actually undertake inquiries with the petroleum licensing officer, and we do offer phase 1 environmental risk assessments. We offer environmental insurance as well, and as I said, our consultancy services are there for you guys and your clients to use if they do have any questions. So with a phase 1 environmental risk assessment, contaminated land is assessed in incremental steps set out in industry guidance. The aim is to determine whether a site is suitable for its current or proposed use at the earliest point. This allows a decision in the most efficient way, with the steps rising in cost as they progress. The process starts with a qualitative assessment before moving into a quantitative sampling and ground investigations that reflect what is actually present. So we would look at doing a conceptual site model, a qualitative assessment. This quantitative assessment, which will be where a phase 1 still raises concerns that contamination may be significant and at a site, and if it will be necessary to either change the end use or take samples to determine what is actually present. Now, in terms of why you'd need a phase 1 assessment, you're likely to need one when a commercial Groundsure report actually comes back in need of further assessment or at high risk. It's more detailed than a standard desktop report, and it typically includes site history, the geological, hydrogeological and hydrology of a site, records of authorizations and permits and licenses, a site inspection, so looking at the site conditions, the surroundings and the compliance of operations. It will look into further detail on flooding, on ground stability, and it also looks into archaeological and ecological protected habitats and species. We'll also give bespoke guidance on what the reason is for reports at high risk. So if it's the current land use of the property that is at high risk, then we would look at doing this phase 1 risk assessment. If it is recommended, consultations with the local authority and the environment agency would not be sufficient for us to revise the outcome of the report, but it does give you an idea of exactly the detail we go through, and our consultants are happy to actually visit sites. So if this is something that comes up, then you can give InfoTrack a call, you can get in touch with us, and we can actually give you a quote based on the site itself, on the nature of the transaction, and as us exactly going out to the site and having a site walkover and seeing what's there. If it is in need of further assessment because of the past or historic land use on the site or nearby, then we would look at getting in touch with the contaminated land officer at the local authority. Are they aware of the previous use of the site? If they are aware, is it something that they're looking at? What priority have they given it, and what sort of timescales are they looking at? If they're not considering any further action against it, then what exactly are they doing? Can we get it in writing that they don't see it as a risk, so we can attach that to the report so that it appeases any lender questions that might come up? If we do get any information that's sufficient, we'll potentially amend the outcome of the report to acceptable environmental risk. And if a site is to be redeveloped, then we would look at getting in touch with the planning department to clarify what further measures will be required for the development. If it's been recently redeveloped, then we would look at contacting the local authority and getting a proof of discharge from the local council that the planning conditions relating to contaminated land have been undertaken, so that we can actually revise the outcome of the report. So on our reports as well, and to some extent on every commercial report, we will look at some flood aspects. Just at the minute, there are 5.9 million properties at risk of flooding in the UK. And a publication by the Environment Agency released in December 2016 saw the number of properties at risk of flooding had increased significantly. This is broken down to 3.2 million properties that are at risk of surface water flooding and 2.7 million properties that are at risk of river and coastal flooding. This report also saw that individual properties are moving into higher risk categories. Properties at risk of surface water flooding have risen 13% since 2013-14, and those at high risk of flooding from rivers and seas have increased by around 10% over the same period. There are more than 700 properties that the EA predicts could be lost to coastal erosion by 2030, and more than 2,000 properties could be lost by 2060, even when planned interventions are taken into account. Without beach or seawall maintenance, the Environment Agency says 28,000 properties, of which more than 20,000 are residential, could be lost by 2060. So in terms of the floodings that we saw, there are, back in 2015-16 up in Northumbria, in Yorkshire and in Lancashire, the total cost of businesses affected by these floods was around £513 million, which was higher than residential properties at £350 million. There are, at the minute, over 300,000 business premises at risk, and flooding does account for 33% of all losses to business property. Just to give you an example of how this can affect commercial sites, this was a few years ago at Sheffield Meadowhall Centre, where flood water filled the ground floor of the shopping centre in Sheffield. The centre was closed for a week, and in the September of the year, 58 of the 95 shops that had suffered damage remained closed. The flooding occurred just as centre owners British Land were planning to sell a 75% stake in their £1.7 billion investment asset. And in February 2009, a 50% stake was sold based on a reduced £1.4 billion valuation, largely brought about by the economic downturn. And then just in terms of flood risk and the planning process as well, developers and applicants need to consider flood risk to and from the development site, and it is likely to be in their own best interest to do this as early as possible, in particular to reduce the risk of subsequent significant additional costs being incurred. The broad approach for assessing, avoiding, managing and mitigating flood risk should be followed, and the table on this slide shows what type of development should be permitted in the different flood zones. This helps developers and landowners determine if their site is suitable for use, and the Groundsure commercial reports will highlight which flood zone the site is in and if further flood risk assessment is required under the National Planning Policy Framework. Ground stability is also something that we look for on our reports, especially more than ever with the flood risk getting higher. It obviously makes the ground more susceptible to collapsing, and in some areas, and depending on what sort of soils are underneath, it's vital to know so that you know what the risks are, and we can actually get surveyors involved to actually do a site walkover and see what the state of the actual ground is. Now, there are 6 key causes of ground subsidence as defined by the British Geological Survey. These are shrink swell, so clay soils, certain types of ground, which is commonly clay, can change volume due to the variation in moisture. This changing volume can cause ground movement, which could potentially affect building foundations, pipes or services. We will also look at dissolution features. This is where soluble rocks such as chalk contain layers of material that can be dissolved by water. This can cause underground cavities such as sinkholes to develop. The cavities reduce support to the ground above and can lead to a collapse of the overlying material. The third biggest one that we will look at is landslides. So this will refer to the downslope movement of materials such as landslide or rockfall, which may lead to a loss of support and damage to buildings. We'll also look at compressible ground, collapsible ground and running sand. And as you can see, there's around 30 to 40,000 insurance claims every year. And it costs the insurance industry on average £300 million a year, which rises to £1 billion in a year that's either extremely wet or one that's extremely dry. We'll also look at man-made subsidence on our environmental reports, and displayed on the screens are some of the sources of man-made subsidence that we'll look for. We have some 5,000 years of historic mining in the UK. So coal mining is another large source of subsidence claims. These are generally dealt with outside of the insurance industry by the Coal Authority, and they have apparently dealt with over 500,000 claims in the last 30 years. To give you a little background, mining generally started out as shallow scrapes, and in the case of coal mining, early coal mining tended to occur in the form of bell pits, which, as the name suggests, were bell-shaped and tended to be shallow and known to collapse. As time went on, mining increasingly turned deep underground and probably peaked around the 18th and 19th century. This has left us with a legacy of old mines, many of which we simply don't know exactly where they are. The Coal Authority, for instance, has a huge warehouse of old paper mining maps, which they inspect and try to make sense of. The early maps are in some cases very inaccurate, and indeed we only use mapping dating back as 1842, as this is when Ordnance Survey Map 1 was produced, and it's when it became sufficiently credible and you could actually rely on the accuracy of the mapping. So unfortunately, the Coal Authority still don't know where all the old mines or mining features are, and they still discover and work really hard to locate the various shafts and edicts, depending on where it says they are on the old historical mapping that they use. So the main types of man-made subsidence or mining that we deal with are on coal, tin, clay and brine. However, the UK has a vast legacy of mining, and we have extracted over 35 minerals. So we will highlight if coal is in the area and point you in the direction of getting a coal CON29M report, but we will give you detail on any tin mining, any clay brining, and also if it's in a brine area such as Cheshire where that mining went on. And something else to be wary of as well is that they are coming up with some issues in the building of HS2, not just in phase 1 as you can see here, but also in phase 2 as well. But the government have some advisors that have warned that many locations along the HS2 rail line have unstable soil, putting high-speed trains at risk of derailment. In a damning study of the HS2 route, scientists from the British Geological Survey named 3 specific sections of phase 1 of the line as having very soft, fine soils, which are vulnerable to track and ground displacement under the pressure of trains travelling at the speeds planned for HS2. HS2 is intended to run at 225 miles per hour in routine service, which is faster than any other rail-based trains in the world, and rising higher still to 250 miles an hour after a few years. So the BGS scientists warn that these speeds could generate waves that can cause track and ground displacements. They add that these characteristics are likely to occur at many locations along the HS2 route, specifically naming 3 sections: around Perivale in West London, Aylesbury in Buckinghamshire, and Hampton in Arden, just south of Birmingham, as being at particular risk. There are a couple of sites that have come up as well on phase 2, especially one around Middlewich and Woolwich in just south of Lancashire, which actually has this old salt mine that is still commercially used today, where they're going to either have to shore up the sides of the track, or actually run the train slower through these sections, which completely defeats the purpose of a high-speed train network. So then just moving on to the commercial reports that we offer and looking at some of the differences and showing you exactly what is included in all of our commercial reports. So we will often speak about mapping looking at either low detail or high detail map, which I'll show you the differences of, but all of our reports look at 1 to 10,000 detail maps. All of them have an opinion on acceptable banking security, which I'll take you through in a second. As I mentioned, they all have bespoke recommendations and next steps. They all have some element of flood risk data in them. And we will reassess any reports free of charge if you give us more information that could be of interest to the data that we've come up with in the report. And all of our reports are written and peer reviewed by our qualified consultants. So you basically get the 2 opinions for the price of 1, just to make sure that we're sending out the right information and making sure that it's in line with what everybody's thinking on the consultancy team. So this is an example of the 1 to 10,000 scale mapping that I mentioned. This is the low detail mapping. So we use Ordnance Survey 6" to the mile, which is 1 to 10,000 mapping, and we use the more detailed 25" to the mile, just to allow specific features of concern to be seen more clearly in urban areas, as well as greater detail for buildings and railways. So this Ordnance Survey 6" maps record most man-made and natural features in the landscape and represented the first comprehensive survey of all of England and Wales at a consistent scale and specification. It is said that every road, railway, field, fence, wall, stream and building is shown, and even smaller features such as letterboxes, bollards and quaysides, mileposts and flagstaff. Within the mapping, uncultivated land is distinguished by different symbols for marsh, bog and rough grassland. Types of woodland are also distinguished, so birch, fir, firs, brushwood, as well as parks, ornamental grounds and orchards. All public boundaries and administrative boundaries, including civil parish, borough and countryside boundaries, are clearly shown, apart from certain boundaries within towns. So you can see the level of detail we get from the low detail mapping, and then as we show you the high detail mapping on the same site, you can see the difference in what it brings up. Now, if I draw your attention to the bottom left, if I just go back, you can see that we have the allotments down in the bottom left-hand side. But on the higher detail mapping, it's not only allotments, we can also see that there are sludge lagoons there. So when we look at the high detail mapping, that is what our consultants will look for and offer this in our high detailed reports so that you get a more accurate opinion and guidance on the report, so that it gives you that bit more detail if a site is to be redeveloped, for example, so that you can actually have that bit of information and report it back to your client on there. So we also ask these banking security questions, which are very important in terms of the lenders, because as I said, we work very closely with a few banks, and these questions are written in accordance with them so that not only your client is actually backed up by the information that we give, but the lenders are as well. If, for example, they have to repossess a site, they know that they're covered based on the report that we give. So we'll ask if there is a risk of statutory or third-party action being taken against the site, and this will refer to whether historic land uses carried out on site are likely to mean that the site would be investigated under Part 2A of the Environmental Protection Act, and subsequently, is there risk that the site owner may be liable for any remediation required under this legislation? We will ask if the property does represent acceptable banking security from an environmental risk perspective. This will refer to whether a bank could securely lend money on the property from that environmental risk perspective. The bank would be concerned with ensuring that the loan made would be repaid and that nothing from an environmental liability standpoint would prevent the lender from being able to repay the loan, and also ensuring that if it came to the eventuality that the bank would have to repossess the property and thus become the site owner, they would not be caught as the Class B person responsible for remediation that may be necessary on site. We'll also ask, is the property value likely to be impacted due to environmental liability issues? And what is the potential for environmental risk associated with the property ownership? i.e. that a prudent purchaser may wish to consider further. And just to give you an example of how that can happen, Midland Bank actually became directly liable for a clean-up of a site that it had repossessed. The owner of the residential site in Dartmoor had used part of the site to deposit over 13,000 used tyres, many of which were contaminated with oil. Midland repossessed the site on default of the loan without inspecting it, and once in possession, the regulatory authority served a clean-up notice on Midland, which had to pay tens of thousands of pounds to remove the tyres and restore the site. So just to give you a bit of information, we've updated our reports that will be going live next week on the 15th. So we now have a new look Groundsure screening and Groundsure review. And when we're putting this together, we do a lot of work behind the scenes just to make sure we're putting the right information out there. So we do at least 6 months of research with commercial solicitors, just to make sure that we're putting the right information in there, that it looks how they want it to look, that it's got the most relevant data in there, and that we're covering bits in what sort of data they want in, and also we're making sure that this is right for market before we actually go live with it. So we've been doing this for the last 6 to 8 months, just to make sure that the layout and format, the price is correct, the content is right, and also that it adheres to the practice notes as set out by the Law Society as well. So in terms of the improvements that we've made, these reports only cover relevant information to the site. So it's a slimmed down report where we will have all the information for contaminated land in case an environmental solicitor wants to get involved and actually look through it. But if, for example, it comes up that there isn't a flood risk, then we won't put the flood information and mapping and data in there. We will say that we've checked against it. There is no risk. There's no point having this information in there. So it saves you having to go through bits of the report to try and find things that aren't relevant to the site. We've tried to write it in plain English and jargon free so that your client can understand the reports. And all this means it's got fewer pages, saves you guys a lot of time in actually interpreting the reports with your client and sitting through them, going through it. And they all use a site boundary based on master map and land registry polygon data as well. So the screening report has changed in its look and feel, but now it covers fully contaminated land. It covers full flood information, which it didn't before. It's got full energy infrastructure information in there. So it will look for things like fracking sites for conventional oil and gas. It will look at any wind or solar farms that are going in, if there's any going in, if there's any existing. It covers full ground stability and does a radon check, and it will screen for transportation as well. Now, this report was developed in conjunction with leading UK banks, and it does meet lending and security compliance and addresses your obligations under the Law Society's practice note on contaminated land. It is a report that we say should be used for lower level transactions. This is one of the reports that, as I mentioned at the start, will go through our risk algorithm and will then be passed to our consultants if anything comes up. So it won't go into as much detail. It'll look at that low detail mapping that I showed. And it also doesn't cover as much detail in terms of the hydrogeology of a site. So it is one if you're dealing with multi-site portfolios. If you're looking at any sort of refinancing work, this is the one that we would recommend. And then here you can see how the report will look from the 15th. We've tried to set as much information out on the front page, make it really easy to read. We even went into as much detail when we did the pilot with certain commercial solicitors on which logo they wanted for the flood risk and contaminated land. And you can see quite clearly, as I mentioned, for example, ground stability has passed. You'll notice that there isn't a page number next to it. That's because we haven't included all the detail in there. So it's quite clean, it's quite clear, as much detail as we can on the front page. And also on the second page is we will give our recommendations. So it will highlight all the risks on the front page. On the second page, we will tell you exactly what your client needs to look at in terms of the risks that we've highlighted already. And then we've got the review, which is our all-in-one commercial offering. So we brought out a residential equivalent about a year ago, and the first question I always got asked was, when are you bringing out the commercial equivalent of that? So we've got the review, which will look at that high detail mapping. This report is written from front to back by our consultants. They will look at every single high detail map that's associated with the site. So if there is one map for every year dating back to 1842, they will look through it and actually see what's been there before and give that bespoke guidance and opinion based on that historical mapping. Not only does it go into full contaminated land, full flood, radon, ground stability, energy as well, it also gives full transportation information. So it'll look at HS2. It also does London Underground, Crossrail 1, Crossrail 2. It will do planning constraints, as will the screening report, but this report also comes with the option of getting full planning application information as well. So when we did our research into these reports, 50% of people said they wanted planning information in it, and 50% of people said, if you put planning information in that report, I'm never going to buy it. So we've given you the option of having the report with or without at no additional cost. And it has got all the features as before, just with all that slimmed down report, the relevant information, and also just the look and feel of it being a bit quicker, saving you guys a lot of time. And these are all the reports that we offer. So you can still get the bespoke reports. So you can get a plan view report, a flood view, you can get a Groundsure Underground report, a HS2 and Crossrail report, and an energy report. This report ties everything in together and just makes it a lot quicker and easier to use. And the feedback on the report has been great, with people just saying that this is the only report that they'd ever need to get. And it is just based around saving you guys time on each report. So making it so that your clients can read it, your clients can understand it, and not look through. So this is the one that if you're dealing with, just because of the amount of detail that it goes into, if you're dealing with any redevelopment work, if you're dealing with any high-end transactions, if you're dealing with any contentious sites, so you know it's a petrol filling station with underground storage tanks, because of the level of detail this report goes into, this is the report that we would recommend that you get. We also offer a Groundsure Agricultural report. Now, this is for sites that are agricultural but are staying as agricultural. If your client was looking to develop a site, then we would recommend getting the review. And that's because the agricultural report has a lot of information in there that wouldn't necessarily be important unless you were keeping it as it is. So it will give you the soil grades, for example, so you know if crops can be grown on it, and if and what sort of crops you can grow in the soil. It does a riparian ownership, so you know if there is any waterways on a site, who's responsible for cleaning them up. Any rights of way, so any historic public footpaths, who looks at the ground, at the hedgerows as well, and has to look after and maintain them. Any archaeological sites of interest. All these bits that, unless you were keeping it as agricultural land, then you wouldn't find them important for the transaction that you're dealing with. And as I said, we are a full consultancy service, so if there's anything ever that you need, any in-house training, any client care letters to give your clients an idea of why they should get the environmental reports, and we also offer product collateral that InfoTrack can pass on to you, such as product cards, sample reports, and things like that as well. And that's everything from me. Thank you very much for your time. I'll pass you back to the guys at InfoTrack.
Andy, thank you for your time today, and we hope those of you who joined us found it informative. If you have any questions about any of the reports you've seen today, they're available on the InfoTrack platform. If you'd like more information, please contact your account manager and they'll be able to assist you. Thank you, and we look forward to welcoming you to another webinar soon.